Hello and welcome to Beyond the Test, Strasz Talks, our Strasz Assessment Systems podcast. I am your host, Dr. Rory McCorkle. I'm Straz's VP of Business Development, and we are your provider for technology and test delivery services for the credentialing industry. I'm really excited for our conversation today. I'm really pleased to be joined by a longtime colleague and collaborator, Terri Hinkley. Terri is the CEO at the National Association of School Nurses and has had a lovely career here in credentialing as well as in the association space, which we'll explore in a second, along with talking about just the means by which credentials can contribute to organizational growth and the role of alternative credentials in that framework. So, Terri, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me, Rory. I'm excited. I love to talk about, as you know, because you and I will geek out about this often, but love to talk about the topic and happy to join you today.
Well, thank you. And we'll look forward to exploring that here in a minute. But first, want to start with just, how did you find your way into the association and credentialing space? I know it's been a bit of a circuitous journey.
Yeah, it really was. But, perhaps not dissimilar to some, I actually started out as a certificant. So I worked in clinical research for over 20 years and discovered a credential. And I was like, oh, I love this. I can actually demonstrate that I have this competency and prove to people that I know what I'm doing. So I did the credential, earned the credential, and then as often is the case, just started volunteering. I was an item writer, then a committee member, started to become more engaged with the association, was on their board of directors, and then their longtime sort of chief operating officer left, and the executive director was looking to bring in and embed some more of the industry knowledge actually on the staff team. So he asked if I was interested, and so I was, and that started in 2013, what has just been, probably my favorite role thus far, which is working in professional associations and focusing on supporting professions and the workforces that work in them. So it was sort of a bit of both. And I was a consumer and a credential holder, and then dove in and learned a ton actually about the validity of credentials and how they're developed, and how they can be leveraged over the course of someone's career, which I've just thoroughly enjoyed every second of it.
Well, and it's been a joy to see you, as you've migrated, if, as it were, in the profession, because I know I got to meet you very early in that first association role and have seen you at a couple organizations since. So it's just been a joy to see you not only work into those roles, but also work so deeply into the profession. So,
Yeah,
um,
it's awesome.
with that said, let's turn to a very hot topic these days, and that is alternative credentials. And of course, this particular conversation has not been without its controversies, particularly in let's say the more staid side of our profession. But would love to get your perspective. Just how do you see alternative credentials? For those on listening here, these are things like certificates, assessment-based certificate programs in particular, micro credentials, etc. How do you see them changing this landscape within credentialing, and what unique value they offer?
Yeah, I think the most important point that I'll make is that I don't think they're changing the industry. I think the world is changing the industry, and these are ways that we can respond to that. What I mean by that is the world in which we work and live is rapidly evolving, as we all know. We can see it and feel it all around us. Work is changing, roles are emerging. And what used to be, and while there has always been change, I've been listening a lot lately to someone called Peter Layden. And I don't know, Rory, if you've ever seen his work. I totally encourage you to go and watch some of his YouTube videos. He was an early 90s guy with Wired magazine, and he does a lot around the future of technology. And he talks sort of about these movements, these eras, and the era that we're going into, the AI era, he almost likens it almost like another enlightenment era, which is when things like the industrial revolution emerge. Like these are game changing technologies that are going to change the world. So in understanding, even though there has been change incrementally over time and we've all adapted and lived through those, the precipice of change that we're on is significant. And you have to think of those kind of world change events to be able to conceptualize where we're going. But as the world changes, the work environment changes, the work that we do changes. And I'll use an example that you and I worked on 10 years ago, but it's always sort of my go-to example for how these micro credentials can serve a profession well. We had 3 role-based credentials at my former association, and they were, very popular, well represented the industry. We did job task analysis every 5 years, continued to refine and grow those programs, but we were hearing more and more from potential candidates that they didn't meet the eligibility requirements for these certifications. And what was happening and wasn't emerging in the job task analysis was that the roles, now remember, we had 3 role-based certifications, the roles were changing significantly. New roles were being added as the industry grew and it became a little more professionalized, a little larger scale clinical research projects. So they started adding team members and sort of breaking up roles into separate and distinct roles. So we never would have caught that change. Maybe in 5 years too late if we followed our typical cycle of the job task analysis. But in listening to that feedback and going out and doing some additional research, we realized things were changing much more rapidly than our typical cycle of certification, development, and maintenance would indicate. So we introduced some different credentials. We introduced a new foundational credential for anyone that worked in the industry in not a particular role. And we started building micro credentials that allowed for certifications in targeted specific domain areas so that people could build their own portfolio. Because again, as they moved in one area, you might have responsibility for something you didn't have in another role. And it gave them a lot more flexibility to be able to build their own portfolio of competencies and credentials to demonstrate that they were competent practitioners. That was 13 years ago, 12 years ago maybe. And we've only become more, more complex since then. And role evolution continues to change and emerge so quickly. I think it's almost a business imperative that we understand what the areas of emerging competency are so that we can be preparing our professionals for those and also validating and recognizing the competencies of staff that have them.
Well, of course, I couldn't agree more. And, it's wild to think about how long ago that was, building micro credentials in an age where that term wasn't even really in the vernacular. So incredible to think back on, to say the least. Now, I think going back to your point about this being driven by the workforce and by the changes that are going on in the world of work, how do you see these offerings, these alternative credentials, being able to drive, let's say organizational change first, but also hopefully growth as a result of that, whether that's pulling in, to the point you've just made, kind of a broader audience, new individuals, as well as deepening engagement with those you already serve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the more flexible your pathways to credentialing are, the better it is for the organization, most certainly. And if you and I have had this conversation before too, Rory, if you can get the customer stories, if you can talk to them and find out where their pain points are, what they need from their employees, what they think is coming down the road. It really just, it shows your responsiveness. You're a partner that they're going to want to work with. You're someone that's offering them solutions, because don't we all need solutions to our problems at the end of the day? So the diversification of credentials and possible pathways to be able to get there not only resonates with employers, but I'll also say with the credential holders. I attended a panel a few years back at an American Board of Nursing Specialties meeting, and I'll never forget it. It was a bunch of nurses that were just about to graduate from college. And we were asking and talking to them about what they wanted. Did they value certification? Did they see themselves seeking certification? Tell us about what that looks like. And they 100% want credentials. And I'll tell you, I still think that millennials and Gen Z, especially in a gamified world like we live in, they want those badges. They want to be able to demonstrate that they've got, those skills and traits, and they want to differentiate themselves from their peers. So I still think there's a huge demand for it, but how they engage with it, they have some pretty interesting and unique challenges and or perspectives. First of all, they're digital natives. So they want everything to be able to be done on their phone or digitally. So, again, I'm not sure what other credentialing organizations are seeing in terms of uptake of live remote proctoring. These kids had all of their exams, these adults, I'm sorry, I shouldn't call them kids. That's not polite, but these young adults have done all of their college exams online. They're very familiar with live remote proctoring. They're going to want to lean into that. They're not going to want to go into test centers. But the other thing that I heard from them that never left me was they also have significant debt loads. Student debt loads are just off the charts right now. They can't afford a $300 or $400 credential. They just can't. But if you can chunk it up and give it to them in pieces, they will absolutely build that credential over time in a way that's more affordable to them. So not only is it an opportunity for employers to really drive practice and what standards and competencies should look like for industries if we're listening to them, but those potential customer stories are also so valuable to us to be able to build credentials that they can engage in and with in a way that works for them.
Well, and I just want to follow up on one thing that you've said there, because, one of the repercussions of that kind of change, is certainly not only a change in how you fulfill it, of course, how the credential, micro credential, what have you, is delivered. But indeed, that also creates a lot of downstream change, whether it's financial management, changes in technology, operational management. As you've worked through this with varied organizations, what have been the biggest factors that you've had to confront internally, whether that be culture or just ways in which the organization has to adapt to that kind of new business model?
Oh, you're just so funny that you asked that question, because that's exactly it. I'll tell you, 90% of the time, it's the process and systems that we build ourselves into technology solutions that are really rigid. And this is the only workflow. And it's, here's the steps you have to go through. And as soon as you step outside of that, people melt down because the system wasn't built that way. And now you're talking major revisions. So again, I would say process and systems was our bigger challenge, not necessarily culture, not necessarily getting the board on board, because I think presented with the data in a compelling way, they certainly saw the need. It was just, okay, how do we break down those systems that we had previously designed to be one way and one way only, to allow for the flexibility and adaptability? Sometimes that's new technology. Sometimes that's, completely re-engineering the system that you have. But I think that vendors now, you're also seeing a lot more. I would say we used to rely on one single source for everything. We had an association management system, and we expected it to do all of our association management stuff, all of our marketing, all of our certification, all of our eligibility verification, maintenance of certification, continuing education records, like everything had to be built into one system. And I think we have learned that it might be better and you might be better served by bringing in almost like a hub and spokes kind of system or
Mm.
technology where you have your CRM or even your AMS as the hub, but then you spoke in the best in class of those other pieces that you need instead of relying on one thing to do everything.
No, I think that's a great point, and actually, it's one that I've heard a lot about in one of the nursing certification boards that I sit on because they've been pursuing a similar concept, and so I think that whole concept of a system at the middle and connectivity with other systems via APIs become so front and center when trying to manage this complexity. So it's a great point.
Yeah.
We've
Well, then you can also scale as something grows. Like maybe what you need to start is something, limited and small. And then, but then, as you grow, you can swap that out for something that's much more robust and makes a lot of sense for you as an organization. But you've got the flexibility to be able to do so.
Indeed. Well, we've talked about the candidates so far, the individuals that really rely on these credentials and use them to build their career. On the flip side, of course, a lot of this change has also been driven by their employers
Mhm.
and the industries writ large. So, curious to hear from you again with the diversity of your background. Where have you seen both those demand drivers where employers and industry bodies have really elicited these kinds of changes, as well as some of the barriers for them that you've commonly encountered with alternative credentials?
Yeah, I think that what we haven't seen a ton of barriers, to be honest, because oftentimes I spend a lot of time sort of in this space and in this work. When I was doing my doctorate, it was in human and organizational learning. And I spent a lot of time sort of in that kind of adult learning space and competency building space. And, building competency frameworks, building competency models, figuring out how that goes sort of from entry into a profession to retirement from a profession and what all of those pathways are. And when I talk to an employer, and this, I'll tell you how my competency journey started. My actual competency journey, different from my credentialing journey, was again working in clinical research. One of the three roles that I mentioned was the clinical research associate or monitor. So this is the individual who works on behalf of the sponsor or the pharmaceutical company and actually is responsible for overseeing the work that's being done in clinical sites by either hospitals, physicians, practices, wherever the research actually is being done with the participant. And it's their job to make sure it's being done ethically, responsibly, in accordance with all of the regulations, in accordance with all of the policies, etc. And their role is critical. And their role is one of only, two of the roles that are actually named in any of the regulations surrounding clinical research. So pretty important,
Mm.
important role for those sponsor organization. And they were having a lot of trouble recruiting clinical research associates or monitors. So they started, as often is the case, luring and headhunting them away from other firms and offering ridiculous signing bonuses and offering. So you just had this churn in the industry where this specialized individual or this role, this specialized role, was just sort of being picked off every couple of years and just changing employers doing the exact same job but with increased salaries, bonuses, etc. So there was what the industry called a war on talent. I actually would probably have
Mm.
said a war for talent, not on, because it wasn't the talent's fault. But the problem was, as an industry, clinical research has a ton of qualified and competent individuals. But because it was an important role, every hiring sponsor wanted a minimum of 2 years experience. Well, but did it have to be 2 years of monitoring experience? Was there equivalent experience that could meet that requirement? What actually do you need that person to do? What skills do you need them to have? What durable skills do you need them to have? Who else in the industry has those that with some training and development could be the future monitor on your study? Because if you only work from the same workforce time and time and time again, eventually you will have no workforce because you haven't prepared anyone else for that workforce. So I'm sorry, that was a slight digression, but see, the problem is the sponsors wouldn't have known to ask for how do I identify competent people. All they asked for was how do I find more monitors. It's
Mm-hmm.
like the old adage that if Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses.
Indeed.
Right? So there is a role certainly for listening to the employers and to the industry that you're serving because it's absolutely laden with insights that you can use. But the beauty of it is you hear what their problems are and then you can help identify solutions that are going to actually address the root cause or the core of what their issue is. And if you go to them with a solution, I mean, as soon as I proposed that we develop a competency framework and that we actually map all of these roles and understand what each of them do and what that progression from novice to expert looks like. I had every single one of them provided volunteers and resources to actually take part in that project and be able to map that out. So they'll buy in if you give them a solution that they think is actually going to address their core needs.
Oh, I appreciate that. Not only talking about kind of really the impetus for some of these organizations to be a part of these movements, as well as just that pragmatism of getting data and listening is important, but also interpolating and taking action based upon the association's expertise is also so critical.
Mm-hmm.
On a very different note, you mentioned first off, of course, some of the exposure that you've had through your time in the industry on the test development side and the quality management integrity of the assessments and the products we provide. One of the things that, of course, has emerged as a topic with these alternative credentials is quality, and would love to get your perspective on organizations that are looking at offering these types of alternative credentials. How can they ensure that their brand equity is still there through ensuring good quality and credibility when there
Yeah.
may be, of course, some changes to the process with different product types?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. And I honestly have a one word answer, which is accreditation, because I think it is the only way to demonstrate that we're actually meeting those quality standards, whether it's in a certification, whether it's in an assessment based certificate or a micro credential that might be. Some define ABCs as micro credentials, others domain specific certifications or limited domain certifications as micro credentials. The best thing that we can do as an industry is to adhere to our standards of accreditation, no matter what kind of credential we build. And that I think in some instances, perhaps healthcare organizations have leaned a little bit more into that because, again, the accreditation requirements that they have from bodies like Joint Commission, et cetera, that want to see that programs are accredited. We probably have a leg up over a lot of other industries that maybe not even familiar with the language of accreditation. Why
Mm.
would I get accredited? Like, what's the benefit or the value, especially if the employers that I serve aren't asking for it? Well, you're contributing to an ecosystem that is high quality and above reproach, right? That really is what accreditation gives us, that quality mark, that quality stamp. And you can play an educative role again with your organizations, your clients, your customers to explain to them why accreditation is so critically important for the work that they do and what it demonstrates. You can have confidence that my credential actually measures something meaningful. It measures what it sets out to measure, and that has been independently verified.
Mm.
From a quality perspective, I honestly think the answer has to be accreditation.
Well, I love that perspective, and not only the importance of keeping that quality within the development and execution, but ensuring that we hold ourselves to account in terms of accreditation. I think that's a great message for folks to carry forward. Another let's say misconception and or off frequent complaint or concern that groups bring up when they look at alternative credentials is cannibalization. Again, as you think about your own experiences there, how have you seen organizations introduce and integrate alternative credentials to ensure that it doesn't compete or dilute with perhaps existing certifications?
That's a great question. And that's one that I feel oftentimes is overlooked or isn't considered as deeply and intently as it should be in the process of developing and mapping all of these credentials. And I think it starts with having a really strong, clear map of how all of these align. I'll go back to the example I gave you right from the beginning, Rory. There was some in the organization that felt that the new generalist certification was going to cannibalize the other programs. It didn't at all. What it did was opened up a pathway for the people that couldn't sit for one of those exams. So, again, if you clearly articulate who the target segment is, what the credential is, what it's actually measuring, and map it with your others and perhaps even others that might exist outside of your organization, I think that's the smartest thing that you can do. It also reduces confusion in the candidate population because it should be clear to them. And I would love if every profession and industry had competency frameworks, if they had, sort of career lattices so that you could map everything. I'll give a shout out to ATD because I think they've done an absolutely outstanding job in this area, sort of building that career trajectory within learning and development and all of the pieces and components that go to that. That's sort of what I think is a really great, almost gold standard the rest of us can hold ourselves to, is just make it explicitly clear for your stakeholders, your candidates, your customers, your organization, your industry, how these fit and support the broader ecosystem that you work in.
I think first off, it puts a big spotlight on important for organizations to have that target audience defined to begin with, as well as whether it's done by persona building or some technique to define that. Important to put that work in, and also just to add to what you were mentioning. You're referring to the Association for Talent Development, if I'm not mistaken, in the work that they've done with their program. So just for those who may be looking to follow up on that as an exemplar.
Yeah.
Well, as we come to the end of our time, we'd just love for you to put a capstone on here. As groups are looking at their candidates they serve, their stakeholders, the potential pool out there, as well as where they're going with regard to their portfolios. If you had to pick kind of a top couple list of considerations as they think about whether that should involve alternative credentials, what might you suggest?
I would suggest, who are your professionals of tomorrow and what do their jobs look like tomorrow? Because I don't think you can go wrong if you can answer those two questions. Who's going to be in those roles and what is that role going to entail can take you down some really, really interesting sort of pathways as you consider how to evolve your credentials to keep up with the industries that you're serving.
I think that's a great note to leave on, and certainly one that is a quick statement to make, but also a deep part to follow up on, and certainly well worthwhile for a lot of organizations. Well, yeah, Terri, I just want to thank you so much for spending your time, lending your expertise here on the podcast. Really appreciated having you on.
Well, thank you for the invitation. You know, I love talking about this stuff, Rory, and always enjoy our time together. So I appreciate you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. And for our listeners who have spent some time here through the end with Terri and I want to thank you for that as well. Keep an eye out for our upcoming podcast, which we'll post in 2 weeks. Do be on the lookout for that. And in the meantime, be well and take care. Bye bye.